On tonight's episode of Mr. Norris's In Case You Missed It, we look at the Nat Turner slave rebellion. Why did it happen? What took place? And we try to make sense of whether or not Nat Turner is a hero or a villain. Hey, hi, hello, and what is up, everybody? It's your host, Mr. Norris, the history teacher with the good hair. And tonight we're going to be talking about the Nat Turner rebellion. Nat Turner's super interesting character in American history. I love teaching about him for a number of reasons. Mostly, it's an interesting story, but also mostly because of the interesting argument about whether or not he is a hero or a villain. And we'll get into all of that. Just some quick background though, and some refresher for you guys. If you've seen some of my previous videos, I have talked about slavery in the South and what it was like in the 1700s and early 1800s. And I want just to refresh you all for a minute here that slaves did go through some serious hardships, if you will. Obviously, and I think this is pretty common knowledge, one of the hardships that slaves went through were beatings and whippings and punishments for various things such as running away and or not completing tasks on the plantation, or even just completing tasks on the plantation not to what their owner's expectation was. That could also earn you a punishment or some kind of beating. In addition to that, a common practice in the South in this era was to separate families and sell them to different plantations. Oftentimes, they didn't want mothers and fathers to be concerned with raising their children. Anything that could possibly take away from their production and what they were accomplishing on the plantation was to be gotten rid of. Those were considered distractions. So families were separated and children were sold to different plantations, thus, in a sense, killing them off, if you will, right? Because chances are, if you're a slave who lives in Virginia in the early 1800s and your child is taken from you and sold to South Carolina, let's say, chances are you're never going to be reunited and you're never going to see your child again. And in a sense, it's an act of killing your family or killing a family member. So I just want to refresh everybody that that is something that is 100% going on in this era. Now, let's focus on Nat Turner. He was a slave who was born in 1800 and lived his entire life in Southampton, Virginia. Now, he changed hands from a couple different masters over time. And somewhere along the line, he learned how to read and write, which would have made him a little bit unique, a little bit special amongst his peers, as slaves back then were not allowed to learn how to read or write. So I don't think it's quite known exactly how Nat Turner did that, but at some point he did. What Nat Turner was probably most well known for prior to his rebellion that he leads is being a preacher. He was a Baptist preacher, and because he could read and write and decipher the Bible a little bit better than some of the other slaves, he was a leader on the plantations that he was on. He would frequently hold Baptist masses on Sundays. And back in those times, especially before Nat Turner's rebellion, sometimes on Sundays, slaves were kind of given the day off, as you know, people back then were very religious, even more so than they are today. And they could kind of travel between different plantations. Well, slaves from nearby plantations would come on over to Nat Turner's plantation, and he would kind of lead mass that day. He began to tell people or communicate to people that he deemed himself to be a prophet, that he was in direct communication with God, and that God was speaking to him. Now, Nat Turner claimed that God was telling him that African Americans, or the enslaved people of the South, were God's new chosen people, and that he was sent here to lead a rebellion and liberate his brothers and sisters. It seems that in history, whenever we have a historical figure that claims that God is speaking to them, it's always to lead a rebellion. It's never like God is telling them to open up like a froyo restaurant or something like that. That's never the message. For whatever reason, I don't know. It's always to lead some kind of bloody, chaotic rebellion. But that's what Nat Turner had been telling his followers, and he was preaching to this to them on Sundays, unbeknownst to his owners. In his own words, he said the time was coming for the last to be first and the first to be last. And Nat Turner, mind you, was not talking about a peaceful rebellion or a peaceful revolution. He was definitely saying to his followers that blood needed to be spilt in order for this to happen. And Nat Turner actually used some things in the Bible for justification. If you're familiar with the Bible, in the Old Testament, the Israelites, in order to gain their freedom from the ancient Egyptians, Moses, called on God or asked God to send plagues onto the Egyptians in order to convince the Pharaoh to release his people. And one of those plagues, and the one that finally did it for the Israelites, was the death of every firstborn for the Egyptians. So Nat Turner reads some of this stuff in the Bible and thinks, look, there's according to the Bible here, there's past justification for this kind of stuff. If I do consider African Americans God's new chosen people, then spilling blood in order to gain their freedom is going to be appropriate. So Nat Turner and his followers start putting into place a plan for a rebellion in Virginia to literally kill their owners and win their freedom that way. Now, in 1831, Nat Turner, I believe in February 1831, he sees a solar eclipse in the sky. Now, if you're unfamiliar with solar eclipses, it is when the moon is directly in between the Earth and the sun. And it appears that blackness or darkness is covering up what appears to be a lightness or a whiteness. And in Nat Turner's brain, he saw this and took it as a sign from God that it was time for, like I said, the last to become first and the first to become last, the blackness to cover up the whiteness, if you will, in Virginia. And he took that as a sign that, this is the year to really get things going, really get things moving. Well, fast forward a couple months to August, and Nat Turner and his followers one night in August begin their rebellion. Now, they mostly are armed with farm equipment. There were some small firearms, but mostly, average plantation farm equipment. And in the middle of the night, they begin slaughtering their plantation owners, men, women, children. In Nat Turner's logic, he believed that you can't just kill the head of the household or the man or the master at that point, because if you just do that, well, then you're not really winning your freedom, because technically you are property, you are owned by him. This master most likely has a piece of paper saying that you're his property, and if you just kill them, you'll be transferred to their wife, and then if you just kill that person, you'll be transferred to the kids, and so on and so forth. You'll still be a possession, according to Nat Turner. In order to fully liberate yourself, you have to wipe them all out. Men, women, children. These murders were absolutely brutal in nature. Nat Turner and about 70 of his followers wreak havoc for a couple days in Virginia on several plantations and kill approximately between 55 to 65 white people. They do spare some households. Nat Turner and his followers, according to record, did go by some small farms with some very poor white Southerners, and Nat Turner spared them. And he said to his followers, because really, to be honest, they're not much, higher on the socioeconomic status or the socioeconomic ladder than we are. So, let them live. But everybody else, a plantation owner, not going to go very well for them, to say the least. So, like I said, about 70 of his followers, they killed between 55 and 65 people in just a couple days span in Southampton, Virginia. Pretty quickly, a militia is assembled, and this rebellion is put down. But Nat Turner does evade capture for about 2 months. And in the meantime, what happens is the majority of his followers are captured, about 55 of them, and they're going to be put up to trial. But also, people in the South are terrified and angry that this happened. And this incites mob violence. And it's estimated that about 120 African Americans in Virginia and nearby states are massacred, killed in the streets. And they had nothing to do with this rebellion, but just because they were black right after the Nat Turner rebellion. Nat Turner's eventually found. He totally admits to his crimes. And he and about 55 of his followers are put up for trial. 18 of them are executed, including Nat Turner. Nat Turner is hanged, flayed, and beheaded, meaning he is, hanged, obviously. Flayed meaning skinned, and beheaded meaning, well, I think you can figure that one out. So pretty gruesome. Why would they do that to him? To send a message, right? In case any other slave gets this in their head that this is going to be a good idea. Lawmakers in the South clearly wanted to show slaves that this was not a good idea. Don't do this. So, pretty rough treatment for Nat Turner there. Now what happens next? Nat Turner's legacy, did he really help the slavery movement? Some people call or consider him an abolitionist. Technically, he was trying to lead a slave rebellion to totally overthrow slavery. He thought that this would spread to other states. But in a sense, he actually wound up hurting slaves. Like I said, immediately following his actions, 120 innocent people are killed. And then in the years that come, many repressive laws are passed in the South against slavery. Laws such as making punishments for running away more stiff. Also laws such as disallowing slaves to even gather and communicate with each other, much like they did during some of Nat Turner's Baptist masses. That stuff is really has a kibosh put on it. So in a sense, you can kind of see where Nat Turner is coming from, but he almost hurt slaves in a way. his legacy is really a really interesting debate topic to talk about in classes. What he was trying to accomplish in freeing slaves and ending slavery is obviously a really great thing. And you can almost understand Nat Turner's anger and want for blood when you think about the things that I described, such as, the terrible punishments and beatings and killings of slaves and separations of families. You can kind of understand why someone would want vengeance. But on the other hand, is he a villain? Is killing women and children really a good way to, gain your freedom? The masters, okay, maybe that's one thing, but then their entire families, I don't know, that might be another. It all contributes for a very interesting debate when it comes to Nat Turner and how he's viewed. Well, there you have it. Nat Turner Rebellion. About 70 of his followers lead a massive rebellion in Virginia for a couple days that kills about 55 to 65 white slave owners in the South. Actually really winds up hurting slaves because of the repressive laws that are passed afterwards. But a very interesting story to say the least. Hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please like, comment, or subscribe. Any of that would just be fine. Remember that history is life. And in the words of George Washington, the surest basis for public happiness is knowledge. So go out there and get some. Have a good night, everybody.